Welcome and thank you for watching. This is the London System versus Emir 1000 Game 1, and this is our first foray into the chess.com intermediate bots. There's already a complete video playlist of the London System versus the chess.com beginner bots, starting with Jimmy 600 and working our way through Kareem 850. If your rating is below 1000, I would highly encourage you to watch some of those videos at whatever your level is currently, and learn more and more about the London System. Also, if you haven't watched the intro videos of where I talk about why I put this YouTube channel together and also how I improve personally. This whole program is about a designed program that I put together for myself to improve at chess, starting at the rating of about 600. And I've worked my way up in the last 8-9 months to a rating of about 1,300, consistently beating the chess.com bots at that level. So I would encourage you to watch those. You'll gain a lot of insight into the purpose of this channel and the methodology of why I emphasize the structure, the strategy, and the tactics of the London System, and learning all of these dimensions of the London System will greatly enhance your playing ability as well as the tactics upon the chessboard. So without further ado, let's begin with the opening of the London, which is d4. Emir responds with knight to f6, bishop to f4, e6, opening up this diagonal for the dark square bishop to potentially attack the king. We move in with e3 to protect both the pawn and the bishop. b6 and b knight to d2. Now, whenever you see a move like this move to b6, more than likely there is this fianchetto coming from your opponent, bringing this bishop along this light square diagonal. It can also occur with the dark square bishop doing the exact same thing, bringing the pawn up to g6, and then bringing the dark square bishop into this fianchetto on this diagonal. So more than likely this is what our opponent is going to do, and we're starting to see a little bit more of the sophistication of the intermediate bots as opposed to the beginner bots. And so we have to learn how to adjust and handle these new situations as they arise. And there it is, the bishop coming to b7 and starting this diagonal here in what is known as the fianchetto. So I'm going to respond with c3 just to go ahead and reinforce this pawn here, and again reinforcing our emphasis upon the middle and trying to control as much of the middle as we can in the opening. It's really one of the purposes of any opening, chess opening, is to try and get control as much as possible within the center. So Emir responds with bishop to e7. We'll bring our next move in the London System and set up our knight to f3. And in fact, if you look right below here, you'll see, as I've mentioned before, the complete setup of the London System. It serves as a template to kind of guide us as we go through these moves. They don't have to be in any particular order necessarily, because you do have to respond to your opponent and what your opponent is doing. Now, we always do start with d4, and then we try to get the bishop out to f4, but after that you kind of have to figure out what's the best move, especially concerning what your opponent may be doing. h5, I'm going to move this pawn up to h3. We've talked about having this safety valve for our dark square bishop to come back and kind of have a place of hiding if need be, and the value of that. a5, bishop to d3. Again, we're really at the point of having the full development of the London System. Emir responds with rook to f8. So I as I've always done, I always encourage you to take a moment to pause once you get the London set up and begin to look at the attacking lines and the potential. And once again, we'll go over those. Light square bishop can come along these diagonals. Dark square bishop along these diagonals for attacking. The e5 square is a prime square for the knight to occupy. And then if this knight moves up to the e5 square, we have the queen that can come out to the h5 square and maybe move down this way along the h file in order to bring pressure upon the king. We also have, if this knight moves here to the e5, we can move this knight into its place, kind of provide some support for that knight as well as some protection for our king should we elect to castle. Now, one of the things that we noticed is with Emir choosing to move the rook to f8, there is not going to be a castle kingside for our opponent. So the king's moves are going to be toward the queen side. So we kind of need to adjust our strategy and our lines of attack accordingly. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't begin in some ways to attack along the king side, but we just need to be mindful of that in the planning of not only our pieces and our positions, but also our strategies and tactics. And those will develop as the game goes on. I'm going to highlight this move of e3 to e4. And the reason I'm doing that is because as I looked at the possibility of my pieces, there really wasn't any good move that I could make that actually would be a lasting move. Let me demonstrate what I mean. I said earlier that knight to e5 is a prime move, and if I made that move right now, all that our opponent needs to do is just move the d pawn up to d6 and target my knight, and now I have to move that knight somewhere to save it. So that's not really a valid move. Same thing for this move with my bishop to the e5 square. Same thing, just bring this pawn up, and now I'm kind of in a position that if I take, I'm going to be taken, and we just exchange, and I'm not really quite ready to do that. So one of the things I've learned in my journey to 1300 at this point is when you don't have any minor pieces that you can move and your structure is already set, start moving your pawns. Start looking at what might be the most valuable pawn move forward to try and maybe either advance your pawns or also to attack maybe the structure of your opponent. And that's basically what I did. I went with the e3 to e4, and my goal is ultimately to get to e5 and maybe target this knight here. So Emir responds with queen to c8, kind of maybe looking to either come along this diagonal at some point or to try and enforce the influence of the queen along the c file. And of course, as we saw in some of the beginner bot games with the London system, bringing our a knight or our a rook over to c1 and targeting the c file is also a good maneuver. So we'll see how the game unfolds. But I want to go ahead and move my e pawn to e5, putting pressure on this knight. I would assume that Emir would move the knight to safety, but instead moves the rook to g8, more than likely trying to maybe target this pawn. So this is a free piece. I might as well take it, and Emir can respond maybe not the best way, but that's the move with bishop to f8. And this is one of those scenarios where I know some might say, well, hey, you just moved your pawn twice. Now are you going to move it a third time? And the answer is yes, I am. The reason for that is because I might as well take this pawn, because I'm going to be taken. This pawn at g7 is going to take, more than likely, my pawn at f6. Why? To open up this file for the rook to come down. So I feel like sometimes if I'm going to go down, I might as well take somebody with me, and that's exactly what I did. And sure enough, Emir answers with moving the rook to g7 and targeting this. Now, if you notice, I have no defense at the g2 square. So I need to create a defense. The easiest thing to do is just go ahead and castle at this point, and now the king can protect this square. A4, again, not worrisome in any way. We can continue on in our development, and I chose to go with the knight at f3 to g5. So this is what I'm looking at with this knight move. I have said before that the coveted e5 square is great, but this could be repelled very easily. So if I move the knight to this g5 square, I will automatically open up the diagonal along the light squares for the queen to attack this pawn. And that's really the aim here. That's what I want to get to. So that's why I chose to move to g5, because I really want to get the queen to this h5 capture here. Emir responds with moving the light square bishop to d5, and so now I can very simply just go ahead and come down here and take. And now, if you notice, we have a converging square here at f7 that black is going to have to defend as we go through the game. So Emir responds by moving his d-pawn up to d6. So if we look at the chessboard right now, after kind of a little bit of a flurry of activity, one of the things that I'm noticing is this e-file here with the king at e8, and wanting to find a way in which possibly to control that, or to at least exert some influence over it. And right now I have an opportunity to develop my a rook to bring it over to e1, and that's what I selected to do. And ultimately I want to exert some influence here, and we'll see how that plays out within the game. The king, in response to that, moves to d8. Now, in so moving, I want you to notice something. The king did have protection for this f7 pawn, which is an incredibly weak pawn, but now once the king moves to d8, there's no more protection for that pawn. Let's move in and take it with the knight, and automatically putting the king in check. Emir responds by moving the king up to d7. And now we need to, again, look at the board and find the most strategic move that we could make right now. So one of the things I'm kind of becoming uncomfortable with, and that is this light squared bishop at d5. And I would like to kind of challenge it and maybe eliminate it, or put in a trade of some sorts to get rid of it. I really don't like it there, especially with the queen back here, who could easily come up to the b7 square along the same diagonal and have this, aimed at the g2 square. So I'm going to challenge this bishop, and if we exchange, that's fine. I have two ways to exchange here with both the rook and the knight. So Emir responds by moving the queen to a6. Looks like a mistake to me. Looks like the move should have been to b7 to back the bishop if you're going to leave the bishop here. But instead moves to a6. That gives me a chance to eliminate the bishop that really I wanted to challenge. And now Emir responds, surprisingly, with, I guess, maybe kind of a Hail Mary move, with the rook coming down to take the g2 pawn. I'm not exactly sure why, but I do have two ways in which to respond, both with the king and the bishop. I'm going to choose the bishop because I don't want to move my king out from my rank here, the 1 rank up to the 2 rank. So I choose that. Emir elects to go a3, and now I have a clear shot back to this rook at a8. and the queen eventually takes. So in that whole sequence, my bishop, my light squared bishop, took Emir's light squared bishop and took both of the pawns, all for the price of one bishop. So we gained greatly in that. If we pause for a moment after a flurry of activity and look at the contest here, we have black with a queen, a bishop, and a knight. And we are here with a queen, a bishop, a knight, and two rooks. So we have and another knight. Let's not forget that one. So we have an overwhelming influence here upon the board, and really the end result is already written in the cards if we continue to play accurately. So I respond by bringing my queen back to g4, and the object is to target this pawn at e6, and I will be protected by the rook at e1. Emir responds with the a3 pawn taking my b2 pawn. Again, I'm not worried. This can happen. I'll capture it. I really don't want to lose momentum, especially since I have an opportunity with my queen to go ahead and check the king, and that will prohibit this move by the pawn or the queen coming down the a file. And so we have check. The king really only has, let me see here, really only has one square to move to, and that is the c6 square, and really the end is in sight here. So now we want to look at how can we keep the king on the run. Whenever you start a series of checking the king, you want to kind of keep that momentum going as best as you can. And as I looked at all the options, the one that really stood out was the knight coming to d8 and putting the king in check. So I chose that one. The king has to move once again. Emir chose to now move out to the 5th rank. And if you will notice something very quickly, I'll highlight this. The queen and this knight and this bishop are all behind the king and not in a position to protect. And the king being at the 5th rank is very vulnerable. So now I'm going to look at where is a connecting square of a couple of pieces. If you'll notice here, the knight here and the queen both kind of converging at c4 would put the king in check and keep this momentum going. I choose to do that. Again, we've cut off these squares for the king, and really there's only one square to move to, and that is a5, and the king moves there. So now I'm really looking at the possibility of a one-move mate at this point. The reason for that is if you just kind of highlight these squares, you see that the king is surrounded. So I don't want to move my queen at this point because it's controlling all of these squares surrounding the king. I need to find a move or a couple of moves very quickly that could put the king in check and close the game out. So naturally, I look to this knight first at d8, moving to c6 because that would put the king in check. But obviously, there's a response by Emir that would negate that. I even looked at this just for a brief moment. That's not going to happen as well. Also looked at maybe the possibility of bringing the rook up, but obviously that's not going to happen. And then thought about bringing the rook over to the b1 square, and then maybe targeting and capturing this pawn, and then controlling this file, and then moving the queen over for checkmate. But then as I went through all the pieces, because I did that with the bishop as well, but as I went through these, I kind of ended up with this knight going, okay, is there anything that this knight can do? And I thought, well, it could move here. And then lo and behold, it dawned on me, that's check. And there's nothing that can capture that knight at b3. And that should end the game. And so that was the move that I made. But I kind of went through all the other minor pieces to see if those could be moved to a square because they seem like the most obvious to me as I looked at the chessboard. And this is kind of part of the discipline of chess that you have to go through is each piece you kind of have to move and see what is the most advantageous move out of all the pieces that you have, and then make your best move. Sometimes you don't get the move that you would really like, but then you just have to settle for the best move. So this happened to be the move and close the game in checkmate. So that concludes our game against Emir 1000. Our first game, we're going to move on to a second game with Emir and see what more we can learn in employing the London against these chess.com intermediate bots. So again, thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next video.